Have you ever found yourself alone in the woods, or when something out there doesn't want you to leave? These aren't campfire tales meant to entertain. They are true stories of terror, stories that haunt the very cabins where they happened. Tonight, I'll take you through 3 horrifying encounters that will make you question whether you'd ever set foot in a cabin again. Let me take you back to 2015. My partner and I were desperate for a break from city life, so we booked a secluded cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains. The first night was quiet at first, but we're not that lucky. It was perfect, miles from anyone, surrounded by towering trees and the kind of silence you can't find anywhere else. Or so we thought. We lit a fire, sipped wine, and let the stillness calm our nerves. But just as we were about to turn in, it started. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deliberate, loud, and coming from the walls. At first, we thought it was just the old cabin settling, but then it moved. One wall, then another, circling us. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of animals. Just the oppressive darkness pressing against the trees. When we returned inside, the knocking started again. This time, louder. And then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Huge, smudged handprints that didn't match either of ours. By morning, we were rattled but still skeptical. Maybe it was just some prank, right? Then we spoke to a local at the nearest store, and their face went pale when we mentioned the cabin. They told us about a group of loggers who vanished in the 19th century, working in that same area. Before they disappeared, the men reportedly complained about hearing strange knocking, spirits warning them to leave. We packed our things and left that same day, driving as fast as we could. But to this day, I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'll hear that knock, knock, knock. The next story is from 1998. A trip that started as a weekend of fun and ended with a nightmare none of us could explain. There were 5 of us, staying in a cabin by Black Lake in Michigan. The first night was uneventful, just laughter, campfires, and stories. But on the second night, the whispers began. At first, we thought it was the wind carrying voices across the lake. Faint murmurs. Unintelligible, but definitely human. We shrugged it off and went to bed. But then, on the third night, the shadows came. We were sitting in the living room when we noticed them. Dark humanoid shapes moving along the walls. But there was no light source, no flickering candles or headlights outside. These shadows had no reason to exist. We ran outside thinking maybe there was someone messing with us. What we saw chilled us to the core. Figures. Dozens of them, walking toward the lake, silent and deliberate. And as they reached the water's edge, they disappeared. The next morning, we left, but not before asking a local fisherman about the lake. He told us the stories, how, during Prohibition, men smuggling whiskey across the lake drowned when their boat capsized. Their bodies were never recovered. And now, their spirits wander the lake, whispering for someone to join them. I haven't spoken to those friends in years, but I know we all remember that night. Sometimes, I wonder if those whispers are still echoing across Black Lake, waiting for the next visitors. The final story is one I'll never forget. In the early 2000s, I was hiking in Oregon and stumbled across an old, weathered cabin in an area known as Devil's Hollow. It was late, I was exhausted, and my tent had ripped earlier that day. The cabin looked abandoned but solid enough to keep me dry for the night. That decision was the worst mistake of my life. As soon as the sun set, I started hearing it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from above me. But the cabin had no second floor. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the ceiling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just an animal on the roof. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural whisper. It was faint at first, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it wasn't natural. My chest tightened. and I tried to focus on the sound. Was it coming from the walls? The floor? Then a loud thud came from the corner of the room and my flashlight flickered. When the beam stabilized, I saw my backpack. It was exactly where I'd left it, except it was open. Its contents had been dumped onto the floor, but it wasn't random. My clothes, my gear, they were arranged in a perfect circle with symbols carved into the wooden floorboards at the center. I grabbed my things and bolted outside, but the nightmare wasn't over. As I stood in the cold night air, my flashlight caught something scratched into the doorframe. It hadn't been there when I entered, a series of strange, jagged symbols. The next day I found a ranger station and told them what happened. The ranger's face went pale. He told me I wasn't the first to report strange activity at that cabin. It had once belonged to a man who practiced dark rituals. He'd vanished years ago, leaving behind symbols carved into every surface of the cabin. Paranormal investigators had studied the site and deemed it one of the most spiritually active places they'd ever encountered. I didn't need more details. I just needed to get as far away from Devil's Hollow as possible. And I have never gone hiking alone again. It was 2011, and my family had rented a cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains for a week of hiking and relaxation. We were looking forward to disconnecting from the world, just us and nature. But what we found wasn't peace. It was terror. The first night, we all slept soundly. The cabin was old but charming, nestled perfectly among the trees. But on the second night, just after midnight, we were jolted awake by a sound I'll never forget. A scream. It wasn't just any scream. It was blood-curdling, like a woman in unbearable pain. My dad grabbed a flashlight, and we all rushed to the porch, looking out into the woods. The scream came again, echoing through the trees. "Someone's hurt," my mom whispered, but something felt wrong. The scream didn't sound natural. It didn't rise and fall like a real cry for help. It just cut through the air, sharp and piercing. We searched with the flashlight, but there was nothing out there. No movement, no footsteps in the dirt, just silence. We reluctantly went back inside, locking the doors and trying to convince ourselves it was just an animal. But deep down, we all knew better. The next night, the screams returned, but this time they weren't coming from the woods. They were inside the cabin. It started faint, coming from the far end of the hallway. My little brother screamed, saying he saw someone standing there. A woman, her face pale and streaked with blood. My dad rushed to the hallway, but there was no one there. Just the lingering sound of that scream, growing louder and louder, filling every corner of the cabin. We packed our things and left that night, driving until we found a hotel. The next morning, we spoke to a neighbor who lived near the cabin. When we described what happened, their face went white. They told us about a young woman who was killed in that cabin during a robbery in the 1940s. She had screamed for help, but no one was there to hear her. Her spirit, they said, still wanders the cabin, reliving the night she died. Even now, I can't unhear that scream. It echoes in my dreams, sharp and endless. The year was 1987. My family decided to rent a cabin at Timber Creek Lodge in Colorado for a ski trip. It seemed like the perfect winter getaway. Snow-covered mountains, cozy fireplaces, and nothing but time to relax. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The first night, as we settled in, the doors began to slam. Not just one or two, every door in the cabin slamming shut on its own. My dad joked that the wind was strong, but there was no wind. The windows were closed and the air outside was still. Then came the voices. They started in the kitchen. At first, they sounded like faint laughter, almost playful, but as the night went on, they grew louder, more menacing. It was like a conversation we weren't meant to hear. Angry, guttural whispers that made my skin crawl. But the worst came on our third night. My younger sister, Emily, woke up screaming. She said there was a man standing by her bed. He was tall, dressed in old-fashioned winter clothes, and his skin was pale, so pale it looked frozen. His breath clouded the air, even though the cabin was warm. When my parents checked her room, there was no one there. But Emily insisted. She said the man stared at her with hollow eyes before vanishing into thin air. That was enough for us. We packed our things and left before sunrise. Later, we learned the horrifying truth. In the early 1900s, Timber Creek Lodge was a hub for trappers. During a brutal blizzard, one man was locked out of his cabin by his colleagues after a heated argument. He froze to death just outside the lodge, his body found days later, covered in frost. Locals believe his spirit still haunts the area, seeking revenge on anyone who stays in the cabins. Even now, I sometimes feel a chill in the air, like his icy breath is still following us. Some places were never meant for us to stay. The woods and the cabins hidden within them hold memories, but not all memories are good ones. Sometimes they hold pain, anger, and spirits that refuse to leave. If you ever find yourself alone in a cabin, listen closely. Watch the shadows. And if you hear something, anything, remember this. Sometimes it's not your imagination.